Tell me about the day you got your diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, it was 3 days before Christmas in 2006. So it was an incredible Christmas present. Living in that small town of 12,000 in rural Kansas, my doctor was one of my best friends, and he would come routinely to my office for de-stressing. I do some hypno on him and de-stress him. So it wasn't unusual for him to spontaneously be at my door at the end of a night if he had a really bad time or maybe some kind of critical incident. And all of a sudden he was there and he looked white as a sheet. Well, it didn't really shock me because I'd seen him like that before after, some kind of terrible mangling death, especially of a child. And I said, Aaron, what can I do for you? And he said, it's not what you can do for me. It's what I got to tell you. And I'm like, well, come on in, sit down. Sat him down in my office and he said, Dean, you've got leukemia and it doesn't look good. And he was like, okay. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1000. What, me? This is about me? I said, what did you say? And he says, you've got cancer and it's leukemia and it doesn't look good. And I said, well, tell me what you mean by that. And he said, I have sent it to one of my favorite oncologists that's just world renowned. He was on the Kansas, this friend, Aaron Waters, was on the Kansas KU board of medicine. And so he had friends, top tier friends all around the world. And he said, I've had him take a look at it. He's never seen anything like it. You've got features of both acute and chronic leukemia. He said, and your numbers seem to be escalating rapidly. He said, if things don't change, he said, and we've got to hope and pray they do, but if they don't, you got 4 to 6 weeks. And my daughter was 14 at the time. And I spent 20 years teaching 14-year-old girls. And I thought, man, 14-year-old girls need their dad. I can't leave yet. And so I was just in a state of shock for about 2 or 3 weeks. Literally, I don't remember eating, sleeping. I really don't remember anything other than they would have me go in and take another blood test almost daily to monitor this thing. The only thing I do remember is I got into a local oncologist about 30 miles away down in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And I remember walking in and it looked like I'd walked into a morgue. I was the only one that wasn't just rail thin and pushing around an IV. And the place just smelled of death. And I thought, how did a guy like me end up here? Thankfully, within about 3 weeks, it switched over to chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And my father had CLL, and it's not supposed to be genetic whatsoever. So they were really shocked by that. But I'd watched him go through the process, and I knew that I had some time to make good decisions for myself. And that's when I really started kind of jumping in the driver's seat of my own treatment and recovery.
It sounds like this diagnosis was a complete surprise.
Oh, yeah. He says, well, Dean, he says, your numbers would knock over a horse. He's like, haven't you been tired? I'm like, Aaron, I've been working 60, 80 hours a week. It's not unusual for me to have 1 or 2 suicidal clients going at any given time and coming down here to the office at 2 or 3 in the morning. I just thought being tired was part of my job. It didn't really even occur to me that it would be a part of my health. Yeah.
Leukemia was your first diagnosis.
Right.
You had a second diagnosis. Will you tell me about that?
Well, this was 2007, 6, and then 2007, I was very sick. 2008, I almost died of pneumonia in the summer because my immune system was still so suppressed. I got pneumonia, which isn't infrequent in Kansas because there's so much wheat dust in the air and so many allergens. It's not unusual for people to get pneumonia. And I got pneumonia and I just couldn't fight it. And boy, that's not a way to go. Let me tell you, when it got bad, I would cough and cough and cough and cough and gasp for air, pass out, wake up, get 2 breaths, start it over again. Finally, I ended up in the hospital, and the same doctor was standing over my IV. And I'd known him for years, and we'd worked a lot of cases together, and I'd seen him in a lot of traumatic situations. And when I woke up and looked at him, he didn't see me open my eyes, and he looked scared. And I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, you're awake. And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, what's going on? Because I had passed out and woke up in the hospital. And he said, not much. You just, you passed out, you ended up here. He said, I said, well, what's going on? He says, well, he's like, you're not doing too well, but you're fine. And I'm like, Aaron, you look scared. And he's like, no, no. I'm like, hey, man, cut the BS. I know you. He's like, well, all I'm going to say is you got to fight, Dean. You got to fight. I'm like, well, I can do that. And so I clawed my way back and started to get well. Finally, this was July of 2008. By September, I was finally turning around. And by 2009, I was doing well, and all my numbers went way down, and everybody was celebrating, and I was feeling strong again. I was gaining musculature and energy, and we thought, well, that was scary, but we've learned our lessons. I'd made so many lifestyle changes to accommodate this thing. And the common Western medicine lore with chronic lymphocytic leukemia is it's not a quick killer like acute leukemia is. It's a chronic condition that continues all your life, and you have to constantly monitor it. And sometime it's going to kill you. But usually you have a decade or two, sometimes 3 if you manage it well. But it will shorten your life, and it will never go away. And that's why when mine did, it was such a shock. But had a great year, and we were excited, and I was developing my speaking career. I'd written a book, and it was starting to do well. I was making the college circuit. Kansas State University was thinking about buying one of my books for every incoming female that year. And so I was, because it was a book on date rape and how to guard yourself, especially during college years. And so it looked like I was, on the rise, and life was good. And then August of 2010, Mary, no warning signs at all. She didn't have the typical brain tumor warning signs of dizzy spells, loss of balance, memory, any of those things. And all of a sudden, the right side of her face fell. And they thought she had Meniere's disease. And so we took her in for a blood test or a brain scan. And she was so claustrophobic, we found one that a treatment center that had an open brain scan imaging place. And so we got her there, and they let me sit in there with her because by then she was starting to get really dizzy. And the technician was acting She was acting a little too friendly, a little too lighthearted. And, I'd been watching people for 25 years by then. I'm like, I'm like, hey, everything all right? Oh, yeah. You'll just need to call your doctor. And so on the drive home, I called the same guy, Aaron. And I'm like, hey. And he's like, yeah, I just looked at her brain scans, Dean. He's like, and I'd driven up to Wichita, which was 60 miles north of this tiny little town. So it took an hour to get home. And he's like, when you get home, call me. And I'm like, Aaron, I'm not a dumbass. Something's up. You're going to make me wait an hour for terrible news. I'm not going to do that. He's like, well, I don't want to tell you this, on the phone. And I'm like, then I really knew it was bad because we'd been through so much. And he said, Mary's got a brain tumor. It's one of the worst I've ever seen. I sent it up to KU Medical Board, had one of the world's top 5 brain surgeons look at it. He's never seen one this bad. It's big. And with brain tumors, the effectiveness in treatment is how high they are in the brain and how far forward. And hers was worst case scenario. It was all the way back and down around the brain stem with all sorts of ganglia and fingers. And so he said, I'm going to call some favors and get into this guy that looked at the film. And so we went up there September 2nd, a couple days later, and he took one more look. By this time, Mary couldn't walk. She was so unstable. And so I had her in a wheelchair. He's like, could you wheel her out, please? I need to talk to you privately. And so I did. And he said, even with laser guided surgery, there's an 80% I could nick, 80% chance I could nick a blood vessel and she'd bleed out on the table, or an 85% chance I could nick a nerve and she'd be a quadriplegic the rest of her life. Even with that, I could probably only get 50% of the tumor. Then you'd have to go down to MD Anderson and go through massive treatment. And I said, well, what would the possibility of her recovery be? He said, well, I'd give her probably months, maybe 6 months at most if we did all of that. And I said, what would that 6 months be like? What would her quality of life be like? And he said, imagine having the worst migraine and the flu all at the same time. And I'm like, that's no quality of life. I said, what would happen if we don't do anything? He said, well, she'll sleep more and more, lose her abilities more and more, and then die in her sleep. I said, will she be in a lot of pain? He said, no, usually not any. And so I said, okay, that's what we'll do. And 52 days later, she was dead. So the ironic thing is I was considered a grief expert in the Midwest. I had done several articles for magazines and periodicals back when there were magazines and periodicals and newspapers, and over the years, and many retreats, done a lot of keynote speeches on grief, and worked with many people who are experiencing loss. And when I experienced it myself, I thought, wow, I'm no expert at all. As a matter of fact, I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And I even called up 2 of my clients and apologized. I said, they were gracious. They're like, Dean, you did great. I'm like, I didn't know. But looking back, one of the reasons it was so devastating for me is I had uprooted myself and from every place I love up here in Oregon and lived down in this little town in Kansas. And it was such a small kind of cloistered town that if your grandparents didn't grow up there, you were an outsider. And so for 30 years, people had, even after 30 years, people didn't call me by name. They called me Mary's husband. And that was fine with me. It was a good gig. But insidiously, it had created my adult identity. And so once I wasn't Mary's husband, I didn't know who I was or what to do. And in this little town, there were many cobblestone streets, one of which we lived on. Every cobblestone had a memory of her. Every area, every person, every interaction. It was just horrible. And so within a year, almost a year to the day, the leukemia came back with a vengeance. All my numbers just went crazy. And it brought with it lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's small cell lymphoma, which many times does accompany chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And that came back with a vengeance too. And so I tried to manage it as best I can. or could, but I didn't really care. And I kind of schlepped through my practice, trying to care for these people as much as I could. I took a lot of time off because I found myself not really in a position to provide help for others. And so I closed up my practice in 2012 and moved back to Oregon, mostly because I almost died of viral meningitis in June. I tried to show Bree, she was really, she developed a tick in her eye because she was so afraid I was going to die too, because she saw me wither away and she saw how morose I was, even though I was trying to fake like I was okay. And so to prove to her I was still strong, I swam across a lake in Oklahoma, not knowing I was swimming through blue-green algae, and it went up my nose. And I guess I went out of my head, and she had to take me to the emergency room, and they life flighted me to another hospital. And I was out for 38 hours. They didn't think I was going to make it. There, Bree was there all alone, and she had to call my folks and tell them that I was dying and it didn't look good and to get there as soon as possible. That was the scariest part of that journey, because when I woke up, I had lost 60 pounds in 6 days, and I'd been out that entire time, and I didn't recognize myself, and I had lesions and scabs all over my whole body because my temperature had gotten so high. It had so much infection, I guess it erupted into sores all over my body. I mean, I was sick. I pretty much lost everything. Now I've got scabs all over my body, and I didn't look like myself because I'd gotten so thin, and I couldn't really stand up because I was weak and dizzy. And it was the most, I've had migraines before, but this was like a migraine on crack. It just blindingly painful. And the worst part of this was they had to send my results, my blood work results, and some of the biopsies they took to California because they didn't know if it was viral meningitis or herpetic meningitis. And we had to wait 5 days praying that it would be viral meningitis, because if it was herpetic meningitis, it would continue to eat away my brain and I'd lose all my memory. And so I'd end up being, somebody that would have a 10-second recall. And so for 5 days, I laid there in the hospital with this terrible migraine thinking, shit, I've lost everything. Now I'm going to lose my fucking mind. It was the lowest point of my life. Thankfully, they came back. I've never been so happy to have viral meningitis in my whole life. He says, Steve, you've got viral meningitis. I'm like, yeah. Hallelujah. And they're like, and I'm like, oh, this is great news. Yeah. And it took me 3 months. It took me, for the first week, I couldn't read because my brain was so swollen, and they couldn't promise me that ability would come back. So to all of a sudden not be able to read, it really terrified me. I thought, what's life going to look like if this doesn't come back? Because, and most people wouldn't have been too alarmed because they know how well the body bounces back. But I'd lost so much by then that didn't come back. I thought, this is one more thing. I thought, well, maybe I can, get a job shoveling horse shit. I don't know. I'll do something. But thankfully, within about a week, I was able to start reading again. Couldn't remember much. It took me 2 weeks to really be able to start walking without assistance. And so I got some hiking poles. And, people ask me, Dean, how did you swim 10 to 12 miles a day for 22 days? It wasn't as hard as I think it was day 8 or 9. I got 2 hiking poles, went to the local track, and it took more grit to get one time around that track in July of 2012 than it did to swim 10 or 12 miles a day for 22 days in 2014. I really think life prepared me to do these extreme events. I remember, newscasters saying, geez, Dean, you've got leukemia and lymphoma. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you just finished your 100th mile. How are you doing this? And I didn't really know how to answer them. And so finally I just blurted out, well, it's a lot better than being in a hospital bed. And I've spent a lot of time in hospitals trying to come back, and this isn't as hard as that. And that's true. So, yeah,
You walked the track. You brought yourself back from the brink of death, and you still were a cancer patient.
yeah,
There must have been a moment, because you've described so many low moments, but there must
yeah,
have been a moment where something changed in your head and you knew that you wanted a different life. You were going to change what you were doing to get it. Will you tell
right.
me about that?
Yeah, it was August of 2013. I think it was August 13th. I remember it specifically because I'd moved back to Oregon thinking that would be the elixir, the cure all. Getting to be back in this beloved place in the mountains by the ocean with my family. I didn't realize I was giving up all my adult friends and my practice, which was the last piece of adult identity I had, my profession. And I was renting for the first time in 30 years this dark little duplex. And so for a year, I just spiraled into just abject misery. And August 13th, I had made a practice never to look in the mirror because I didn't recognize myself post viral meningitis. And I just continued to wither away. I was down to 152 pounds. And you've always, when we've been together, I've always been between 210, 218. So 152, I literally looked like I walked out of Auschwitz. You could see my pelvic bones. Well, anyway, I made a practice never to look at myself. And I remember having to use that same, I'd been a triathlete in the 80s and 90s. And so I'd learned how to dig deep and get way back in my head and make my body do just by grit and will what it didn't want to do when I was tired. And I noticed it was only 10 steps from my bedroom to the bathroom, but I was having to use that dig deep muscle. And so I was leaning on the bathroom counter just to kind of get my breath. And I looked up and it shocked me how different I looked even than the last time I'd looked months before. And I had red rimmed, swollen eyes. And the guy I was looking at looked so sad. It just broke my heart. And I thought, I'd never been suicidal. I thought, you know what? I've had a good run. I've had a really deep love, a good marriage. I've written a book. I taught a lot of kids. I raised a good daughter. I've kind of accomplished everything I ever wanted to. Not as much as I wanted to, but I've had a good run. I'm done. And I'm just gonna let the leukemia and lymphoma take me, and nobody will know. Nobody will know it's suicide. I'm just gonna let nature take its course. And I'm okay with, oh shit, my daughter's 21. She just lost her mama. This is an entirely selfish thought. I can't be so self-absorbed in my own pain that I forget her. And so I decided right then, man,
I've got to find a way to come back. I don't want to, but I got to find a way. And I'd helped a lot of people use Viktor Frankl's work and man's search of meaning for meaning and being passionate about a purpose. And I'd seen that be so successful. And so I decided, and you know, I many times after that was just a poignant moment because I remember looking in the mirror and I said out loud, "Oh fuck, I look like I've been through Auschwitz, but you know what?" And I said this out loud, which probably makes me sound crazy. But you know what, Victor? I haven't been. You were, and somehow you made it out. So if you made it out, I can too. And so I started praying and asking several times a day, just centering down and saying, what's my purpose? Because I know the brain by its very nature has to answer every question you ask. And so I just asked and then let it go and asked and let it go. The longest it's ever taken me was 3 or 4 days to get a really good solid answer. 3 or 4 weeks later, it's crickets, man. I got nothing. And so I looked around and I'd been living in this duplex for 6 months and I hadn't even unpacked a box. I was still, it looked like a bachelor pad or worse yet, maybe, a frat house. And I hadn't even put my bed together. I was mattress on the floor, I mean, that's how bad I was living and how little I was interested in living. And so I thought, you know what? While I'm waiting for the universe to answer, maybe I should unpack some boxes. And that's when I unpacked a box that my mom had put some childhood things in. And I ran across a diary I'd been forced to keep in sixth grade. And I thought, well, let's see what the 11-year-old dean had to say. And open it up. First page says, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And every time I talk about it, Tom, I still get goosebumps. A shot just went through me, and it's like, I forgot this kid. Both my parents had been mountain climbers. I'd grown up in the Cascades, and until I was older, all I'd ever wanted to do was be a sponsored adventurer and climb around the world and take pictures and write for the National Geographic. And so that's what I had planned to do, and I'd forgotten that. And I felt bad that I'd forgotten that kid and that desire. And I thought, well, I'd known several that had climbed Everest, and my numbers are so bad, I didn't think my blood counts or my immune system could handle elevation or even a meal in Kathmandu. So, but I thought, I can swim the channel. And so for months, that's what I decided to do. And so immediately I called Aaron, even though he was in Kansas. We were still in pretty much constant contact. And I'm like, hey, Aaron, I feel like myself for the first time. I know what I'm going to do. He's like, what? I'm going to swim the channel. And it was just crickets. He's like, what? I'm like, yeah, I'm getting in the pool. I'm going to start training tomorrow. He's like, Dean, you remember viral meningitis, man. He's like, you get in a public pool, it'll do the same thing. It'll kill you. He's like, you really want to tempt fate twice? And I'm like, I got to do something. I can't just die sitting on a couch watching Wheel of Fortune. I got to go out swinging. And he's like, well, promise me this. He said, it's going to make you look like a total idiot, but you got to wear one of those nose plugs that kids wear, because that's how viral meningitis got up there. And if you close that, even if you get an infection, it won't go to your membrane, that permeable membrane between your sinuses and your brain. Promise me you'll do that? I'm like, I can do that. He's like, okay. He's like, call me, tell me how it went. And so that next day I did it. When I pushed off the wall, it was the first time in 3 years I felt like myself. And so I started swimming. I made myself swim and one more lap every day. And by Thanksgiving, I was swimming a mile. Blood counts were going in the right direction. My head was clearing. I was gaining musculature and weight again. I was feeling good. I get out of the pool right before Christmas, and the thought comes to me, who cares if another middle-aged white guy puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good, and in my case, it's not going to be a pretty picture. So I thought, okay, what could I do? And so I went back to that same, started asking and praying, what could I do that would be like this, that would do the world some good? And I remembered 30 years almost to the day before, in 1984, I'd gotten this vision of swimming the entire length of the Willamette River. But I had put that dream away because as a 24-year-old, I was trying to start my teaching career, build some money, buy a house, do all the responsible American adult things. And so my wife, Mary's like, really? You're going to take 3 weeks off to swim a river? Why are you doing this? How are we going to pay our bills if you take 3 weeks off? So I just abandoned it, never really thought of it again until it came back. And when I remembered that original dream, another rush just welled up within me. I'm like, yeah, I don't care if I die doing this thing. I gotta do it. And when I went, within about a week, I went and told my parents, and I thought they'd be thrilled. And because they had been such adventurers themselves, and my mom cried and begged me not to do it. She said, please, at least just wait till you're in remission, or could you at least just swim the channel? Do you have to do this big thing? Can't you just, because the channel will just be one day instead of weeks, please? And I'm like, well, I'll think about it, but I knew at the time I wasn't going to do it. And so they, for months, this was January, for months, they tried their best to talk me out of it. And then in mid-March, they decided, well, he's not going to be dissuaded. We'll join him. And then things really started rolling. It was funny. At that same time, Travis Williams joined me. He's the Willamette River keeper guy. He's the cartographer for the Willamette River, and he's written a book, got all sorts of maps. And so he and my dad and I sat down and we looked at it. Dad broke it down into stages, and that's when things really started rolling. So, yeah.
You were monitoring your blood counts the whole time. You said they were going in the right direction after you'd started training.
Mm-hmm.
But when you swam the river, it took you a little over 3 weeks. What kind of medical supervision did you have?
None, except for Aaron flew out from Kansas on day 16 just to make sure I was okay. And he had brought his skin-fold calipers with him. And when he saw me, he's like, oh, shit. He's like, take that wetsuit off, because he met me coming in to the end of a stage. And so I did. And I was so used to him poking and prodding me. We just fell back into our old routine. He's checking my lymph nodes and doing all sorts of stuff. They're in the park. People are walking around. And he pulls out his skin-fold calipers. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, you're thin, man. And he starts pulling, writing things down. He's like, shit, Dean. I said, what? He's like, you are down to 3% body fat. He had come in because the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society were having this big gala event. I wanted him to be there with me because he'd been such a big part of this story. And he'd thrown in a couple $1,000s to the cause to help me to have the money to do this. And so I wanted him to be there with me. So he'd come in for that. He's like, we've got the gala event tomorrow, and I knew you're planning on swimming during the morning and then maybe Sunday. He's like, all I want you to do is take the weekend off and do nothing but sleep and eat. And I said, really? That's going to put me behind. He's like, behind what? He's like, he's like, there's no fixed finish, man. And I said, "Oh, I see what's going on. You're making all this up because you're here for the next couple of days and you want me to take you to the beach and us just kind of hang out." And he laughed. He's like, "Well, it works for me, but that's not why." And so that's what we ended up doing. And then the cool thing is when I went back after, and he went home after a couple of days rest, the water temperature had gone from 43 to 56 or 52. Felt like a bathtub. And it was the first day, no, it was day 18 I met him. Yeah, because it just took me 4 more days. The last 4 days I did without hypothermia. It was the first time I wasn't constantly hypothermic. And so it was pretty easy.
You finished your swim, and this is an enormous milestone. You met your goal, but at
Yeah,
some point, you got to have blood drawn again. You got to have
right,
another blood test. What
right.
was it like when those results came back?
Scary as hell. Because by this time, right before this swim, my parents were so worried about me. Well, it was not right before, it was January of 2014. The swim was June. My dad had been dying in 2002 of CLL, and he couldn't get insurance to get him what he felt were the right doctors. He wasn't getting any good answers from the doctors. And it's his life, and he's sitting on a mountain of money. So he thought, okay, I'm going to find a good doctor. And he found the world's #3 researcher down at University of California, San Diego, Dr. Juanerio Castro. And those two hit it off. He's like, man, he's the only doctor that's ever come in, and he'll sit down, explain everything to me, and we'll chat for 30 or 40 minutes. It's like I've never seen anything like it. And this guy's brilliant, Dean. And he's like, I'm going to make a call, see if he'll see you, because they were really worried about me. And I think they thought I'd gone crazy because this is when they were still trying to talk me out. Yeah, so went down there. He did indeed try to talk me out of it. He said, doing something like this could kill you. And I told him the same thing. I'm like, I'm dying anyway, right? And he's like, yeah. And I said, well, I'm not going to die on a couch. I've seen what that looks like. So if I got to die, I want to die doing something. I didn't think I would, though. I really didn't believe that. It didn't feel like I would. And so he said, well, you're going to have to get frequent blood tests and let's schedule. I think it's going to be very disastrous almost for your blood counts. So if you won't do chemo and radiation now, and if you're doing this big thing, I don't want you to do it yet. Let's schedule it for after. And so after, I thought it was right away, but it turns out, Tom, it was like 3 months after. I went down, flew down, took the blood test, and he came in and he said, Boy, Dean, I don't know what to tell you. Well, I'd heard those words before, and I thought, oh, shit. And he saw my reaction. He's like, no, no, no. And I'm like, what? He's like, I don't know what to tell you. I can't find any hint of the leukemia whatsoever. He said, if I hadn't diagnosed you myself, I'd have felt you were misdiagnosed because leukemia, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, is never supposed to go away. And I can't find a trace of yours. But he said, I'm really worried about the lymphoma, though. Your lymphoma numbers are up. We got to track that. And so we tracked it over the next few months, and it started to get very aggressive. So I went down to see him again in March, and he said, man, we got to do immediate chemo and radiation. This is getting bad. And they were swelling up even more, which really surprised me because I thought with the leukemia gone, the lymphoma would subside. And in those 3 months, I had been researching in eco-psychology, looking at trying to find online different research studies that would boost NK or natural killer cells and help lymphoma. And because, if nature healed my leukemia, it would be silly for me to think that nature couldn't heal my lymphoma.
and heal it so dramatically and so quickly. And so I found forest bathing and all sorts of great research studies by Dr. King Lee over from Nippon University, and how that just 1 hour of forest bathing, especially in a conifer forest, which we've got a lot of out here, emits phytoncides. Those phytoncides, if you're just breathing those in for an hour, boost your NK cells by 200 and 300 times for 2 weeks. And so I thought, okay, I'm not a genius, but if it does it for 2 weeks, if I go out every week, and not just for an hour, but maybe for 24, then it'll become exponential. It'll start folding in on itself, and we'll get a great snowball of healing rolling. And so I started that May of 2015. And I told Dr. Castro this in March, and he was like, okay, Dean, but now you've got to go and get a blood test either weekly or at least twice a month up here at OHSU. And we've got to monitor this closely if you're not going to do what I suggest. And if it gets to this number, I'm just going to demand that you do it, or I can't work with you because it'd be unethical. And I said, well, that's fine. Let's do that. He's like, okay. And by March, and almost immediately, all my numbers started going in the right direction. And by March of 2016, the lymphoma was gone. So in about 9 months, everything changed again.
What did Dr. Castro say this time?
He said, wow, I don't know what to say. He said, you should go to Vegas. He said, you're quite the gambler, and it's paid off in a big way twice. He said, I said, do you think it was the phytoncides? And he said, I'd have to look at the research, and he really didn't want to talk about it. But
This
he was
wonderful.
thrilled.
There was a point in your journey where you were praying to discover your life purpose.
Right.
And you regained your life. You now have a wonderful life. But Dean, what is your purpose?
Yeah, I believe my purpose is to inspire others. I think I've been given this incredible gift of life. And I believe my purpose is to inspire others to get out of this postmodern digital cloud and reconnect with first themselves, then others, and nature. Or maybe I've got it backwards. Reconnect with their natural environment, nature, as a way of learning about themselves as a creature. And I believe, having been raised in a fairly strict Judeo-Christian household, I always saw and was taught that man was the supreme being and above all others. I now do not believe that at all. I see us as equal creatures and beings on this living planet. And it's absolute arrogance to think that I'm more important than a tree or a beaver, or even smarter. We're learning now about how trees communicate in ways we had no ideas, and they've got a community and they do all sorts of things together. And we're learning about animals in ways we never have. I just think the next thing for we as a race is to get off of our egocentric throne and take our rightful equal place with all the other beings, living beings on this planet, and learn how to connect with everything as a part of the whole. And I think as we learn to connect with nature, nature will do like it did for me, and it will heal us in ways more than just physically. So my purpose is to shine a light on the power of nature and its healing first, and then help people learn how to connect.